Welcome to the Norwegian News with your host, Father Deacon Ananias. Let me just do a couple tests here. Looks good. Mic's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I wasn't happy with my first lecture on epistemology, Quine and naturalized epistemology. The lighting was bad. The room that I was in was bad. And so I just decided I'm going to do it over again. So let me know how's the sound. Is it sounding like sound? So for those of you that don't know, Quine Willard Van Orman Quine was an American philosopher. He was a logician within the analytic tradition. So within philosophy today, you have basically two streams, mainstreams, continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. You could count a third stream as historic or history of philosophy. But Quine was within the tradition of analytic philosophy, and he was recognized as one of the most influential thinkers of the 21st or the 20th century. He was born in 1908 and died in 2000, was associated and affiliated with Harvard University, and also had to do with the logical positivists in the Vienna Circle. So for those of you that don't know, the logical positivists, or the Vienna Circle, that was promoting logical empiricism, were a group of philosophers and scientists that were drawn from both the natural and social sciences, logic, mathematics, and they met regularly from the periods around 1924 to 1936 at the University of Vienna. Chaired by Moritz Schlick, who was one of the founders. Also, you have notable thinkers Hans Hahn, Philipp Frank, Otto Neurath, Rudolf Carnap, Fiegel, Richard von Mises, Menger, Kierkegaard, and others. And loosely associated with that group, you're going to have Tarski, Hempel, who else am I missing related to this? Ayer, and Wittgenstein. So a lot of these were Bertrand Russell as well. Frege were involved in the sessions. And so what today we're going to do is we're going to focus specifically on Quine and Quine's his naturalized epistemology. Naturalized epistemology, well, perhaps we should first turn to epistemology, which basically and generally been conceived and regarded as a study of the foundations of knowledge. Now, where does the naturalism come in? Well, from a naturalist point of view, epistemology is concerned with the foundations of science. Now, maybe not everybody's going to agree, but some philosophers believe that concerning this, it has ultimately the inquiry of epistemology has been reduced into an inquiry into logic itself and set theory. So this is some of the things that were being discussed within the Vienna Circle, Rudolf Carnap and his reductionism within that project. However, according to the philosopher Quine, all these attempts have failed. They failed to produce any adequate theory for the justification of knowledge. So what Quine's going to ask, if that's true, if all these have failed, what's left for epistemology? So today I'd like to discuss what Quine's vision for epistemology is. What is his naturalized epistemology? What's his project of naturalized epistemology and his proposal. So let's clarify this in the talk today. Next, I'm going to try to discuss Quine's naturalized epistemology and how exactly it proposes to study human knowledge, and whether Quine's project has any room for the normative. And finally, I'd like to consider the philosopher Barry Stroud and his arguments from skepticism in light of Quine's theory, to see if Quine's own proposal is inconsistent in any way or incapable of being carried out under the banner of epistemology. So one of Quine's famous works is entitled The Two Dogmas of Empiricism. And here Quine gives us a clear idea of what his epistemological view actually is. His idea is, and I'll pull a quote here for you, quote, "The totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs is a man-made fabric which impinges on experience only along the edges." The fabric that he's speaking of here is what Quine calls the entire web of beliefs. And if you saw Jay Dyer and I discussing yesterday, this coherentist theory replaces the traditional foundationalism, the classical foundationalist model, and also this idea that there's a one-to-one correspondence between propositions and the world, but rather both in terms of the truth values of those propositions and their very meaning. The coherentist idea, as Quine explains within the web of belief, is that both meaning and truth take on meaning and are true relative to the paradigm in which each proposition, term, and meaning is all contingent upon one another within the overall framework and fabric of your paradigm of web of beliefs. And that conceptual scheme, again, has to square and with experience. So oftentimes, Quine's going to say, that requires for you to often revise your conceptual scheme in order to square it with experience. And it has to be squared with experience, at least, as Quine says, the framework and web of beliefs impinging on reality on the edges. Because if it doesn't have anything to do with reality, again, you cannot make predictions. You have no practical application. You wouldn't be able to get things to work within one's paradigm or scientific paradigm. So that's why Quine's saying that. And Quine understands conceptual schemes as really tools for science, the tools of science. And guess what? Those tools are for predicting future experiences, and again, for making and doing the techne. And within any given conceptual scheme, certain entities, which he says can be considered myths, can be posited for the purpose of working out, quote, a manageable structure into the flux of experience. So what does he mean by that? Well, within the philosophy of science, you have, on one spectrum, metaphysically, it would be considered naive realism. Realism, a natural ontological attitude is what some would posit, in which we're pointing out by the entities that we name within science, like electrons, quarks, atoms, forces, weak and strong, and the various other entities. Well, from a realist point of view, that actually maps onto reality, that they actually believe that there are these entities within nature. On the other side of the spectrum, you get what we call the metaphysical quietists, anti-realists, in which they're going to say, those entities, as Quine's saying right here, really should be considered as myths, posits, And they don't have a correspondence to reality necessarily. In fact, that's why they're saying we're metaphysical quietists. We're not making any ontological claim about the ontological status of the things that we're positing. But we need them in order for our science to work and to make accurate predictions within the whole web of belief. And the idea is to have that coherent within the kind of language game of the scientific paradigm. In the middle, again, between the two extremes of naive realism, realism, Noah, which we call the natural ontological attitude, into the anti-realism, you have those in the middle who are going to say that, well, I'm not necessarily committed to realism or naive realism, and saying that these entities like atoms and quarks and the various things that science talks about are actually the way they're just in reality, that they're actually the way that we describe it corresponds to reality. In other words, that the atom, for example, Bohr's atomic atom, where we have the nucleus with the electrons spinning around, they're going to say it's not as if the way that we describe that, the atom exists in nature exactly as we describe it, but rather it's a model. And perhaps for those who are in the mean between those two extremes of naive realism and metaphysical quietism or anti-realism, you might have a group of philosophers and philosophers of science who say, well, it doesn't correspond directly to some entity in the real world, but our posits and the things that we talk about in science do, for example, the Bohr's atomic model, do describe patterns discovered in nature. So that's just kind of given the various views within the philosophy of science. But another important move for Quine is working out his naturalized epistemology is his rejection of Carnap's reductionism. And Quine points out within epistemology, or the epistemological program, within the history of that, two divisions have been made. Divisions into what he calls the conceptual, which concerns meaning, and the doctrinal, which concerns truth. So as I said earlier, again, what you have within the coherentist model is two things going on, something both concerning meaning and also the veracity or the truth values of the propositions that we make. And coherentism is trying to make sense of that and replacing the classical foundationalist model of epistemology. Well, let's go a bit further and ask, well, what's his understanding of these two divisions? And here we can turn to a quote from Willard Quine, where he states, quote, "The conceptual studies are concerned with clarifying concepts by defining them, some in terms of others. The doctrinal studies are concerned with establishing laws by proving them, some on the basis of others." And you can find that in Epistemology Naturalized, his book. So you're going to ask, well, how does this relate to reductionism? And the answer is the program is really, again, divided into two projects, a conceptual project and a doctrinal reduction project. Quine mentions and lists various philosophers who have attempted this and, of course, have failed. Of the various philosophers, Quine declares, quote, "It was Carnap in his Der Logik Aufbau der Welt of 1928 who came nearest to executing it," end quote. However, it's important to note that Quine rejects Carnap's reductionism here. And this reduction is made explicit in his book, The Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Dogma that he's referring to is the dogma of reductionism, which Quine denies. And it's the idea that with each statement, there can be associated, quote, a unique range of possibly sensory events such that our occurrence of any of them would add to the likelihood of the truth of that statement, taken from Two Dogmas of Empiricism. So what Quine's doing is he's rejecting such a conceptual interpretation, and he replaces that with the idea that our statements and predications and propositions about the external world face, as he states, a tribunal of sense experience, not individually, but only as a whole corporate body. So when I say that there is a tree that is green outside, and that proposition is to have a one-to-one correspondence individually with the phenomenon and the entities and the external sensible world, i.e. the sense experience, Quine is rejecting that one-to-one correspondence, that what we're sensing corresponds and maps on perfectly to an individual proposition. He's saying that this only makes sense within, again, our whole web of belief, that our sense experiences as a corporate body of beliefs rather than a one-to-one correspondence. In other words, statements only have meaning. Statement, the tree is outside and it's green, that statement only has meaning within the greater fabric or web of beliefs of our entire language structures. That actually is Quine's conceptual program clearly stated. But according to Quine, the doctrinal project is actually in worse shape, the conceptual side of epistemology. Barry Stroud, who is another famous philosopher, contemporary philosopher, puts it that the doctrinal question is concerned with, quote, whether our knowledge of external physical things can be adequately justified on the basis of purely sensory knowledge. So that's really what the doctrinal question is concerned with. Whether our knowledge of external physical things, like I mentioned, the tree is outside and it's green, whether that can be adequately justified purely on an empirical grounds of me receiving sense data. But the idea is that one could validate science as true by deducing simply from empirical sensory experiences. What Quine's saying there is that seems ridiculous. And in fact, it seems impossible. Let's see, I think I've got a couple quotes from Jaegwon Kim. Regarding this, he says, so it is agreed on all hands that the classical epistemological project, conceived as one of deductively validating physical knowledge from indubitable sensory data, cannot succeed. Again, this was touched on last night, which is exactly the idea of the classical foundationalist project, that our foundations are these kind of self-evident empirical truths of which we could infallibly deduce knowledge from, and indubitable. So not only infallible, but indubitable. Why? Because it's self-evident. You can't doubt it, is the idea. And what Jaegwon Kim and Quine is saying, that's impossible, has not succeeded. And neither has it succeeded. The project's just even theoretically impossible. So we're going to go further into that. But for Quine, it's Hume. It's Hume who actually adequately shows this and demonstrates this by providing, as you might know, his problem of induction. And that establishes, is the philosopher Robert Fogelin puts it, why Quine rejects the doctrinal project or the doctrinal demand from epistemology, or that epistemology should provide justification of our empirical knowledge. In other words, it's as Jaegwon Kim says, it's because Quine was simply an unapologetic Humean that he rejected the doctrinal project of validating science from sense data. And that's also exactly what Robert Fogelin states in his aspects of Quine's naturalized epistemology, that he was an unapologetic Humean, and that's why he rejected the doctrinal program of validating science from sense data. Therefore, the idea is if we abandon the traditional project and we give up the idea that philosophy's claims to knowledge are more secure than that of science, here's the question that arises: what is to be said for the future of epistemology? Quine's answer to that is that epistemology and the epistemological burden should simply be handed over to psychology. That's the project of epistemology naturalized. Quine summarizes this in his Epistemology Naturalized by stating the surrender of the epistemological burden to psychology is a move that was disallowed in earlier times as circular reasoning. The epistemologist's goal is validating of the grounds of empirical science. He defeats this purpose by using psychology or other empirical science in the validation. However, such scruples against circularity have little point once we have stopped dreaming of deducing science from observations. We are simply out to understand the link between observation and science. We are well advised to use any available information, including that provided by the very science whose link with observation we are seeking to understand. So Quine's point here is that since the traditional epistemological project of justification-centered epistemology has failed, what we should do is simply set aside this project and then simply settle with what's available. What's available are observations and science, theory. Furthermore, Quine appears to get around the difficulty of circularity by simply stating he's not in the business of validating science. Not my deal. But merely he understands science and his understanding of science and how it relates to observation. So Quine believes that it would only be circular if one used science to validate science. For those of you that, again, an illustration of circularity or begging the question would be if I pulled up this book right here and I tell you that everything in this book is true, and you ask me, how do I know that? Because on page 105, it says everything in this book is true. That is circular reasoning. And likewise, if you want to validate the truth of science, if you go, well, how do we know science is true? Because science says it's true. It's circular. Quine gets around that by saying that he is not doing that. In fact, doing that, Quine would say, would simply be to return to the old idea of justification-centered epistemology, which obviously he thinks is not possible. And since it appears impossible for Quine to validate science from our empirical observations, he believes it would be better to discover how science is in fact developed and learned than rather to fabricate some fictitious structure to some similar effect, he states. Hence, Quine's project, Epistemology Naturalized, can be understood as being what he says is factual or descriptive rather than justificatory. So that's the move. Let's get out of the business of justification and simply focus on the facts. The facts. And description justification. Okay, it might be helpful at this point to return to the distinction I made earlier between the traditional epistemological project and what Quine proposes. An example I think will be helpful for this and make this distinction much more evident. So suppose person S is asked why they think that object X to be a triangle, why he thinks object X to be a triangle. And furthermore, let's suppose S responds because it's a three-sided geometrical figure, angles, the sum of angles adds up to 180 degrees. Problem with that is that the objection would be to that answer, the objection would be simply, you're just stating the meaning of X. That's not explaining to me how or why the person thinks this object X to be a triangle. Showing that one can simply just substitute equivalent words for another, X is a three-sided geometrical figure whose sum of angles equals 180 degrees. That's not the same thing as showing why one thinks X is a triangle. So what we're looking for when we ask why does S think X or object X is a triangle, what we're asking is the justification for that belief. What is your justification for believing that X is a triangle? And that sort of inquiry is really, and it usually falls under the idea of traditional epistemology. Quine's view, on the other hand, is that either epistemology is the sort of vantage point from outside our world, or it's a project within the world. And since Quine denies that there's any cosmic exile, having knowledge of the world from outside, from kind of God's eye, left with is to reason that the only possibility and the only possible option is scientific epistemology, a naturalized project from within the world. Therefore, according to Quine, epistemology itself should be handled like any other natural phenomenon in the world. It should be studied, described, scientifically, empirically, of course, according to Quine. But it's Barry Stroud who observes Quine's approach and states, quote, or the theory of knowledge is nothing more than the study of what knowledge is and comes to be. And for Quine, there's no reason to suppose that the study of human knowledge or language or thought requires a fundamentally different sort of investigation from the study of physics, animal behavior, or mathematics. All attempts to find out about ourselves and the world must be made from within the conceptual and scientific resources we have available, developed for finding out about anything, end quote. So knowledge itself, on Quine's view, is a natural phenomenon, which means if it's a natural phenomenon, it should be studied by the natural sciences as an empirical study of how knowledge is possible. And that is put in quite nicely and summarized by Jaegwon Kim when he states epistemology is simply to go out of the business of justification. And since on Quine's view, there's no future for epistemology and justification, he states, quote, epistemology, or something like it, simply falls into place as a chapter of psychology and hence the natural sciences. This is the Quinean proposal that I touched on earlier. It's the proposal that surrenders the epistemological burden over to psychology. And Quine explains that the old epistemological project, it had hoped that the natural sciences, that it would contain natural science. Whereas his proposal suggests that it's to be contained within natural science as a chapter of psychology. So again, the old epistemological project hoped to contain natural science, whereas Quine's proposal is that epistemology should be contained by natural science within it as a chapter of psychology. And perhaps you're wondering at this point, well, how is psychology going to attempt to study human knowledge? In what way should empirical study of knowledge fit among the rest of the natural sciences? Well, according to naturalism, nature operates through physical laws of mechanics, which we call physics. And events are connected to one another by antecedent states. And it appears that everything in nature, therefore, is dependent upon these antecedent states. And they're determined by the laws of mechanics within physics. Since really there's nothing over and above nature for the naturalist, guess what? When it comes to knowledge, that must be part of nature as well. Therefore, it follows on that assumption that knowledge must be determined by antecedent events and causes and accounted for by the laws of mechanics, like every other natural phenomenon. And that's one reason why Quine would be justified, no pun intended, in treating epistemology within science itself as a chapter of psychology. To treat epistemology within science itself, Quine proposes that let's just throw out the old concept of epistemology, that epistemology should belong to traditional metaphysics. Why? Because for the naturalist, there's nothing more than nature herself. Thus, traditional metaphysics, which is considered a separate discipline from science, he believes is simply to be viewed as an illegitimate inquiry. The naturalist's motto, in fact, is there is no first philosophy, and philosophy should be seen to be continuous with science. And what Quine does is he refers to Neurath's example of the philosopher and scientist being on the same boat. Remember, Neurath's from the Vienna Circle, and the boat's example is, well, the philosopher and scientist are on the same boat, and they have to build their ship or boat according to whatever's available to them on the ship. In other words, the point is that there's no external position, no cosmic exile, nobody from outside the system from which one could rebuild theory. One always has to proceed to formulate theories, on Quine's view and Neurath's, from within the ship, according to what's already known. So you can't go off the ship, right? You're being supported by it. But this is going back to Quine's conceptual scheme has to be revised to fit and square with the sensory experience. But again, how you revise it is not from outside, but within, on the ship, with the materials that are simply provided. What are the materials that are provided? The only thing available is science. That's his point. And as pointed out earlier, the study of knowledge must entail a study of antecedent causative events according to the laws of mechanics on the naturalist point of view. And that's exactly what Quine proposes. He suggests that we can study natural phenomena, that is, the physical human subject, whereby the human subject is accorded with experimental controlled input, a certain pattern of, let's say, irradiation in associated frequencies. For instance, you're bombarded with patterns, frequencies of inputs from sense data, and in the fullness of time, that subject is going to deliver an output, a description of everything of the three-dimensional world, the external world, and its history. Quine goes on to say that what prompts us to study this relation between input and output is similar to what prompts us to study epistemology, that is, to see how evidence relates to theory. And you can obviously see here the behaviorist influence upon Quine with the input-output. And when I do a lecture on the philosophy of mind, we'll talk about behaviorism and logical behaviorism, in the idea that beliefs are simply to be studied not as private affairs, but external behavior. That there is no kind of first-person subjective phenomenon, that everything is within against the natural sciences, and this third-person objective point of view. And therefore, what it is to have a thought that it's raining is nothing within inside of you, but simply either a behavior or a disposition of behavior. And in other words, the input that from your sense data, that there's rain out there and you're being bombarded with this sense data, to have the thought it's raining is simply to have an output given those external stimuli, those input. And the output is either an action holding an umbrella or the disposition to want to grab an umbrella when going outside. And therefore, it's simply a study of behavior in terms of the natural sciences and within and under the banner of third-person objective point of view and a denial of first-person. We'll get to that later, but before moving on, let me just state what Quine's argument is and state it in a clear fashion. So number one, Quine's saying either there's first philosophy and one can validate physical knowledge, i.e. there's a tree, there's a car, there's a door, that you can validate that physical knowledge from sensory data, or one cannot. Quine says one cannot. And number two, since one cannot, the only other available option is using what we have. What is it that we have? Quine says science. That's what we have. So three, thinking it's circular, Quine says, to appeal to science without first deducing science, i.e. presupposing science to be valid without proving science to be valid. That could be avoided by simply removing the idea, deducing science from observation. Four, Quine's argument is that one can allow for skepticism. One can allow for skepticism within science while avoiding circularity and with avoiding the objections to circularity. By letting the skeptic proceed within science and by way of reductio ad absurdum. In other words, science is either true or it's not. Suppose that it's true that this supposition leads to an absurdity. If that happens, then one can legitimately abandon the scientific method and seek a new method without being accused of begging the question. That's Quine's argument on, summed up in a nutshell, on how to avoid the objection of circularity. Five, his point is an argument. The answer to skepticism is, since we have nothing other than science to go by, it would be by means of science that one would disprove science or raise skeptical objections. And finally, number six, reasons to accept science. Quine's reasons to accept science. He says, what else is there? Two, its methods work. Three, any question to abandon science will always arise within science itself. So guess what? Accept science. That's the idea. But returning to our previous conversation, we see how knowledge can be studied by understanding on the naturalized epistemological project, by understanding its antecedent causes and relating to what Quine calls the torrential output. And that seems, I guess, to be consistent with naturalism's claim that anything that can be understood will be understood according to antecedent events under the laws of physics. However, the objection is going to be, if our knowledge is caused, then is it really knowledge? And that's my argument, my objection to this. It can certainly be the case that some antecedent event X causes me to believe Y at time T. And it just so happens that Y might actually be true at time T. But does that mean, in this case, that I have knowledge that Y is true at time T? See where I'm going with this? Then better illustrate it, let's use this example here of the evil brain surgeon. The evil brain surgeon X artificially induces into me the belief Y. And let's just suppose belief Y is false. So now we know we can do various things like this in brain surgery, that with electrodes, you can hit certain regions of the brain and get people to experience smells and colors, raise their arm, and in fact, and perhaps even introduce artificially beliefs. Now, suppose that evil brain surgeon does exactly that. He's figured out the method in which he can poke with electrodes my brain and get me to believe Y at time T. And Y is false. So the example we could use is, he does brain surgery, the evil brain surgeon does brain surgery on me and artificially causes me to have the belief that Dallas is the capital of Colorado, which is clearly false. I would then have X, i.e. the evil brain surgeon, cause me to believe Y, that Dallas is the capital of Colorado at time T, while Y, the belief that Dallas is the capital of Colorado, is clearly false. Since the brain surgeon could equally have caused me to believe something true, namely Denver is the capital of Colorado, the question is going to immediately arise, how would you determine, or how would you know belief Y is true, or proposition Y is true at time T, if my knowledge is caused and determined by X? Quine's right, that epistemology can simply be understood as a study of sensory impacts, so the causes, the antecedent causes and events, and their given relation to the torrential outputs, whether that's my belief or my predications about the external world. Taking Quine's naturalized epistemology as a legitimate project, one can explain why person believes YT. This caused me to believe it. And isn't that enough for epistemology? It isn't enough. It isn't enough if we abandon the idea that epistemology could ever be foundational in the way, Quine would say, isn't it enough if we just simply abandon the idea that epistemology could ever be foundational in the way that Descartes envisioned it? Well, the philosopher Barry Stroud thinks, no, it's not enough. Even if one could explain why and how a person comes to believe Y at time T, and it just so happens that Y at time T is true, one's explanation on Quine's view could never account for how that person comes to have a true belief. And here's the reason why. Quote, that it is possible for someone to have a true belief and yet lack knowledge. It might have been coincidence or lucky guess, or a belief held for reasons unconnected with the truth of what's believed. That is, let's see, that's from Barry Stroud. And Stroud gives a good example to illustrate this and demonstrate the point. He states, suppose there's someone who believes there's exactly 1,417 jelly beans in a jar. And furthermore, suppose we're asked, he asks us to suppose that there just so happens to be that many jelly beans in the jar. Now, it might occur to you or someone that this certain person that has this belief about the jelly beans in the jar had counted the beans. And that's why he knows exactly how many there are in the jar. But Stroud anticipates this and informs us that the individual, never counted the jelly beans in the jar, was not connected to anybody who had counted the jelly beans in the jar. And therefore, again, it looks like it's a lucky guess. And despite all this, Stroud's person in the example has become convinced that there are exactly that many jelly beans in the jar. Stroud's point is that given these two explanations, namely the person's belief and the explanation of the number of jelly beans in the jar, this isn't going to count, and this wouldn't count as an explanation for how that person got a true belief right. You're going to say, lucky guess, it's a coincidence. That's not an explanation for how the person got it right. They're guessing. In fact, he states, quote, simply accepting both explanations does not provide me with an intelligible connection between the truth of the belief and its being a belief of his, end quote. However, I'm thinking an objection on Quine's behalf could be made simply by stating that this is a case for justified knowledge and not knowledge simply. Well, the philosopher Alvin Goldman argues that it is possible, yes, to have knowledge while not necessarily being justified. That's important. And again, a lot of these topics go back to the Gettier problem, if anybody wants to look that up, whether true justified belief is in fact knowledge. So Goldman's saying here, kind of picking up on a similar argument and discussion, that no, you can actually have knowledge without necessarily being justified. But for example, suppose I think that the best example of justification is found in direct justification. Well, what does he mean by direct justification? Well, things whereby I have access to my own mental states. Roderick Chisholm's terminology for that, having access to your own mental states, is what he calls self-presenting. And I could say that I certainly have justified knowledge of self-presenting statements like, I'm thinking right now. The door is appearing whitely to me. And this goes back to Descartes. These are arguments that Descartes made in his meditations of certain indubitable truths. And it's not just the cogito ergo sum, but self-presenting thoughts like I am thinking, or it is appearing to me in a certain way, which brackets any kind of commitment to the ontology in the external world. Descartes asks, well, how could I be wrong about that? It's appearing that way to me. They may not actually be that way in reality. Or how could I be thinking when I'm not? How could I be being appeared to when I'm not being appeared? And therefore, he concludes that, well, again, you might, that's obviously self-presenting and therefore something that you would know is justified knowledge. Now, you could conclude, as Descartes says, even an evil demon who is powerful enough, or I guess in our case, the evil brain surgeon doing experiments on our brain, in which Descartes would conclude, even under those terrible scenarios, the evil demon could never get me to think I don't exist, or that I exist, when I don't. Or that I'm thinking when I'm not. Or that something is appearing to me a certain way and it's not appearing. That's impossible. And therefore, self-presenting phenomenon as described is therefore indubitable, according to René Descartes. But accepting for the sake of the argument that self-presenting is an example of justification. So what Descartes is saying, what Goldman's hinting at here, is that certainly you're justified in believing self-presenting phenomenon. But for the sake of the argument, self-presenting as an example of justification, let me first give Goldman's definition for self-presenting. And again, I'm going to use some analytic philosophy here, and you'll recognize this. Here is Goldman's definition. If P is a self-presenting proposition, and P is true for S at T, and S believes P at T, then S's belief in P at T is justified. That's his definition. And Goldman gives that definition as a nomological reading. And then he revises it to say, quote, that a proposition is self-presenting just in case it is nomologically necessary that if P is true for S at time T, then S believes P at T. So again, what he's doing is, obviously it's almost tautological here. That if a proposition is self-presenting, just in case it's nomologically necessary, that if P is true for S at T, then clearly S is going to believe P at T. And Goldman points out that this is not necessarily a correct definition, because we can think of a case where the antecedent of this definition is satisfied, but we wouldn't have true belief. And for those of you who don't know, in philosophy and logic, you will have antecedent and consequent. So if I eat this moldy piece of fruit, I'm going to get sick. The antecedent is eating the moldy piece of fruit. The consequent of that is getting sick. So when I state that you might think of a case in which the antecedent of that definition is satisfied, what I mean by that is here you have a proposition that's self-presenting just in case it is nomologically necessary that if P is true for S at T, and yet you wouldn't have true justified belief. Goldman's example proceeds as follows to illustrate this. Suppose that P stands for I'm in brain state B, and that I'm in brain state B is realized whenever S is in brain state B. So that maps on perfectly well to the definition that Goldman provided. But according to that definition, if you remember, such a belief's always justified, the way the definition was set up. So now imagine person S under surgery. We'll go back to our evil brain surgeon, who's artificially causing brain state B within S. So now S believes that they're in brain state B. Well, we'd certainly say S has knowledge that he's in brain state B. But I seriously doubt that any of you are going to say what he knows is justified in any sense. So that goes back to what Goldman's saying, is that, look, you can have knowledge without justification. And the way that he demonstrates that is here by a counterexample, in which case you would agree, yeah, person S has knowledge, but is not justified in believing proposition P at time T, namely that I'm in brain state B. Why? Because it's been artificially induced. Well, probably wondering, how does this relate to Quine's project of naturalized epistemology? Well, the examples provided by Stroud and Goldman that I cited are to show that one could study the causal antecedents, which he calls the inputs, with regard to the human subject and observe its relation to the torrential output, while failing to provide any evidence or insight into knowledge or justified belief. Each of the following cases that I'm going to list provides examples of some antecedent cause and corresponding torrential output that can be understood as a belief. But according to Quine's naturalized epistemological project, now seen as psychology, what would constitute as much in mere observation of sensory inputs and torrential outputs? But recalling the examples, again, that I cited earlier, let me just summarize what these cases are and the conclusion that's to be made from those cases. Case 1. X, the evil brain surgeon, causes S to believe something false. What's the conclusion there? The conclusion is there's no knowledge, obviously, no true belief, and no justification. Okay. Case 2. X causes S to believe that there's exactly 1,417 jelly beans in the jar. Well, what do we conclude from that case? Okay, there's true belief, but no knowledge. And certainly no justification. How about the third case? X, the evil brain surgeon, artificially causes S to believe a self-presenting proposition. And that self-presenting proposition is true. Well, what do we conclude from that scenario, that case? Okay. There's knowledge and true belief, but again, there's no justification. And we're going to need that. We're going to need knowledge, true belief, and justification. So my question is, how is psychology, or how can psychology ever make any of the conclusions just given once the idea of justification is thrown out and replaced simply with observation? And an insight here, we could turn to Paul Roth, the philosopher, who states, psychology studies the chain of associations peculiar to the specific individuals. Epistemology studies those recognized by the relevant community of reasoners to have justificatory force, end quote. The difficulty is that Quine's naturalized epistemology has no room for things like justificatory force. Is Quine, as Harvey Siegel suggests, confusing processes by which a scientific discovery is made with that by which the method of scientific discovery is justified? Well, I wonder what good old Siegel has to say about this. He states, quote, psychological information can never by itself give us good reason for accepting some particular knowledge claim as true. And since this is our criterion for adequacy of epistemologically justificatory claims, it follows that no psychological claim can be an epistemologically justificatory claim, which is to say, psychology cannot be relevant to epistemology. Good quote, Siegel. So by throwing out the idea of justification, it seems that one also has to throw out the normative as well. Simply for the reasons that the very idea of justification is normative. So within the normative domain are the shoulds and oughts. Should I have justification for my beliefs? Yes. Well, guess what? You're in the realm of normativity again, the shoulds and oughts. And again, if you throw out the idea of justification, and since justification entails normativity, then you've thrown out normativity as well, because justification is normative. And since Quine's naturalized epistemology has no space for the normative, my question to Quine and the naturalized epistemologist, why should we think it should be called epistemology at all? In attempting to answer this question, it will be helpful to go to understand skepticism as it relates to Quine's. So what I want to do at this point is an examination of Quine's naturalized epistemology and how it attempts to handle the problem of skepticism. And by examining that, it's going to shed further light on Quine's naturalized epistemological project. And let's consider several skeptical problems. The first problem that we could consider has to do with Quine's assertion that theories are underdetermined by empirical data, meaning that any available evidence that we have is always going to be compatible with the plurality of competing theories. So this is Quine's theory of the underdetermination of data. So considering the experience, your sense data, and again, scientific, the method of science is you clearly want to get your theories to map onto the sense data. Or in other words, you want your scientific theories to be able to account for the natural phenomena being presented to you empirically in the sense data. But the problem is, as Quine points out in his theory of the underdetermination of data thesis, is, guess what? You're going to have a multitude of different, oftentimes contradicting theories and paradigms that all fit the appearances and available evidence perfectly well. What's the problem with that? Well, which one are you going to choose? If they all work, but they're all saying something fundamentally different about reality, it's going to become arbitrary which paradigm or theory that you choose. Now, I'm not saying that, and neither is Quine, that every paradigm and every theory that you can come up with is going to fit the data and square off with the appearances. In fact, there's probably just as much false theories as there are theories that can account for the appearances. And those, therefore, can be falsified. So I know those don't work. But the problem that Quine's theory of the underdetermination of data points out is that you've got all this multiplicity, and perhaps there's even an infinite amount of paradigms that you could come up with, conceptual schemes and theories that all work. They all account for the appearances in sense data, but each theory is saying that reality looks different. Every paradigm's different. Which one are you going to pick? In fact, how can any of the theories explain how we know, for example, there's external objects? Furthermore, why should we even think that the physical theory is the correct theory regarding the external world. Remember, you could have idealism. Idealism is a theory. And that accounts for the data equally well. In fact, a multitude of paradigms all saying something different. So the question arises, why accept the physical theory? Why think there's even a physical external world whatsoever? Because on the idealism model, it rejects that completely. There is no physical world. To be is to be perceived. Second, how does Quine's project propose to deal with, say, Descartes' problem of the evil demon causing our supposed knowledge of sensory data? How does Quine propose to deal with that? What's also known, that's known as the traditional problem. Well, Barry Stroud argues that nowhere in Quine's theory has he actually adequately dealt with the traditional problem, nor does he even discuss how the project could ever eliminate the possibility that our sense data was merely the product of Descartes' evil demon. Doesn't even touch on it, does not even show that the possibility of our sense data was merely the product of evil demon and how he could eliminate that. So it's important to note, as does the philosopher Hookway, that nobody actually believes this to be the case, that there's actually an evil demon out there, or that everything's illusion, that we're locked in a matrix. And by everybody, I mean within the professional world. I know that there are goofuses out there and people that come up with all kinds of silly things. But obviously within the academic and philosophic world, when they refer to all, they're referring to their peers. And so nobody really believes that it's all an illusion or a mere dream. So, well, why are philosophers coming up then with these scenarios? Well, these scenarios are thought experiments, and the responses are created simply and serve to clarify the very nature of truth and justification. So they're thought experiments as litmus tests for how well is your theory going to hold up and be able to give account of the nature of truth and justification. So that's the purpose of skepticism. It's testing all things and holding to what is good and holds up against skepticism. That's exactly what Descartes has created. That is, he believes what holds up to skepticism are the clear and distinct ideas that are indubitable, that cannot be doubted without contradicting yourself. I exist anytime that I'm thinking, self-presenting thoughts, etc., etc. But nevertheless, why should we think that Quine should seek to justify our knowledge of the physical world or attempt to eliminate the possibility of an evil demon producing illusions within us? Because Quine is simply going to state that's returning to the old doctrinal issue of attempting to justify our knowledge of physical bodies. There's a tree outside, it's green, in purely sensory terms. And what does Quine say? If you remember, Quine says we've abandoned that project entirely. Besides, Quine thinks illusions are only illusions, he states, quote, relative to a prior acceptance of genuine bodies with which to contrast them. And bodies have to be posited before there can be a motive, however tenuous, for acquiescing in a non-committal world of the immediate given. Well, what does that all mean? Well, it's the famous argument that when somebody asks, well, what is an illusion? And how do you know everything's an illusion? How would you determine that? Well, the very word illusion means that you're comparing it to something, whether you posit or just simply just believe, to be non-illusory. So what does illusory mean? That would fall short of what you hold to be true and non-illusory. Again, so you have the antithesis. Illusion is contrasted with what you hold to be non-illusory and real. And that's only relative, i.e. the term illusion, to accepting that genuine bodies and entities out there are real, to which you're contrasting. Whereas this isn't real. For example, if anybody's ever seen the rubber pencil, Is it a rubber pencil? See if I can get this. Bear with me. Okay, come on. Can you see it? Maybe it's not working on the camera very well. There we go. Am I having an illusion? What does illusion mean? It means that I've taken and accepted this genuine body, i.e. the pencil, as being straight and rigid and not rubbery. And therefore, I'm going to conclude that when my appearings of the pencil appear not to be rigid and like rubber-like, that must be an illusion. So that's just, a practical demonstration of what we mean to be an illusion. So that suggests that since what the argument against everything's illusion is that since some knowledge is needed to, i.e. this, straight, it's rigid, even to identify illusions, it cannot be the case that illusions stand to undermine, as Quine says, all of our scientific knowledge all at once. That's actually from Stroud, Barry Stroud. So in that sense, the epistemological skeptic would seem to contradict themselves simply for the reason that they assume scientific knowledge in attempting to refute all scientific knowledge at once. Still, Quine doesn't think that this leads the skeptic to an outright contradiction, which is strange. He believes that the skeptical doubts are scientific doubts, and that epistemology is clear and free, and clearly and freely use whatever is available in science to answer those questions. But this is where Stroud comes in. And Stroud's response to Quine's particular assertion asks if there's anything self-defeating, according to Quine, about beginning with scientific knowledge and then ending up rejecting it all. In fact, he asks, quote, what becomes of the crucial logical point that the traditional epistemologists said to have missed? End quote. In other words, Quine appears to reason that since skeptical doubts are scientific doubts, epistemology must belong to the natural sciences, and in view of this fact, epistemology is simply free to use any and all of scientific theory. Remember, what else is there? What else are you going to do? It's just kind of that. Possibly you can make an argument of false dichotomy. A false dichotomy perhaps would present either A or B. Okay, what else is there? Therefore, we have to go with B, science. So you can't accuse me of circular reasoning. But what if those aren't the only two options? And we've seen Quine suggests that the skeptic, again, is allowed to use science to refute science, and that his argument would proceed by reductio ad absurdum, as I just illustrated. But Stroud believes, even if it's granted that the skeptic may be arguing by way of reductio, it doesn't follow that epistemology is part of natural science, first of all. Nor does it follow that if skeptical doubts are scientific doubts, the epistemologist would be in a better position to freely use any or all scientific knowledge of the world in his effort to answer those doubts and explain how knowledge is possible. So with regard to the use of the reductio, it appears that it would not be successful in establishing a theory of knowledge in either way. So just grant your opponent, in this case Quine, what he wants. And again, as Stroud points out, either way you go, you're not going to be successful in establishing knowledge. And you're going to need that if you're in the business of epistemology. Turns out knowledge and epistemology relate. Surprise. So if we suppose, for the sake of the reductio, that science doesn't give us knowledge, And Stroud suggests nothing we believe, therefore, about the physical world amounts to knowledge. However, in the other case, remember I said, give Quine what he wants. Either way. You can go this way or that way, A or B. Even if you suppose the reductio shows that science does indeed give us knowledge. So again, either it doesn't or it doesn't. Suppose it does and shows it reveals, the reductio reveals that science does give us knowledge. That knowledge would merely amount to showing us that we can never tell whether the external world really is the way we perceive it to be. Thus, on this account, we can know nothing about the physical world and our beliefs about the physical world. And those beliefs about the physical world could never amount to obviously what we call knowledge, correct? So what we see here is that Stroud's point is that either way the reductio goes, and this is my point too, picking up on Stroud, either way the reductio goes, we're still left with knowing nothing about the physical world. In fact, Stroud comments that that's not to provide an argument for skepticism. I'm not saying now you have to be skeptical about everything. But what's the use of these skeptical arguments? They're only to show whether someone whose skeptical reasonings understood is falling within the general reductio pattern, whether that person would be in a position to use part or all of the scientific knowledge of the world to show how knowledge is possible after all. In Stroud's opinion, he would not. And after arriving at the conclusion of the reductio, in other words, one can't simply go on to explain how knowledge is nevertheless possible by appealing to those very beliefs about the physical world that we've just consigned to the realm of what's not known. So I'm going to show you how knowledge is possible by appealing to things that I admit we can't know. And you know what that fallacy is. Well, what would one appeal to in this case? Well, let me just backtrack and pick up back on that argument. Even if the skeptical doubts originate in science, in other words, this would not guarantee that one could conduct an empirical study of human knowledge correctly. In other words, what would one appeal to suggest that their empirical study was correct? Like I said, you can't use what you just shown doesn't work, and you can't know to show how you know. So, on having knowledge from an empirical study, how do you know that's correct? Do you see the problem? Well, given the Quinean proposal, one certainly couldn't appeal to the concepts of what? Normativity, knowledge, or beliefs concerning the external world, as I just showed, is not possible on Quine's account. So where does the naturalist go with this? The naturalist is going to go to, and this is where Quine goes to, a theory of reliabilism, whereby the experimental subject is studied and the inputs of the experimental subject are studied, and the torrential outputs with respect to the beliefs. And you're studying that in order to see, according to reliabilism, what generates more true beliefs than not. Okay, that's going to produce more false beliefs, so it's not reliable. So notice that they're redefining knowledge in terms of what's reliable, what produces more true beliefs than not. In other words, it's pragmatic. What works? What do you mean by works? What produces more true beliefs than not? But the difficulty with that position is that the very notion of truth, that we know something, entails that we know something about the external world, doesn't it? And if you recall, for Quine, that's not possible. Why? Because the human subject merely, on Quine's view, posits bodies and projects theories. So we have something more like an anti-realist position with regard to the external world of meager sense data. How do I know this? Because we've got a great quote from Epistemology, Naturalized from Quine. It states, "We are studying how the human subject of our study posits bodies and projects his physics from his data. And we appreciate that our position in the world is just like his. Our very epistemological enterprise, therefore, and the psychology wherein it is a component chapter, and the whole of natural science wherein psychology is a component book, all this is our own construction or projection from stimulations like those we're meting out to our epistemological subject." That's from Epistemology, Naturalized. That entails that our beliefs about the external world really go beyond what the senses provide us. Not only does this indicate that the experimental human subject is restricted to what Quine says is the meager sense data, it follows that each one of us, as Quine says, are in the same predicament. That becomes a further difficulty for Quine and explain how is it possible to form true beliefs concerning knowledge of our human subject when we ourselves, we too are restricted by the sense data, restricted in the same way that the person we're studying are. Hume argued, like Quine, that we are restricted to sense impressions given by experience, but we're united by what he calls instinctive principles of association, something like kind of habits of thought to associate. And that's because, well, he carries the empiricism to its logical conclusion and finds that obviously you're restricted only to your sense impressions and united by instinctive principles of association. But because of this, we're denied access, Hume points out, to any demonstrable knowledge of objective reality. In fact, Hume argues further that within sense experience itself, there are a diversity of sense impressions which remain unconnected. This is what Kant calls the manifold of representations, and David Hume of sense manifold. And the idea of manifold is unconnectedness. So if you, let's see if I can get, really what we have is you're seeing an apple. I don't know if this is going to work. Got it. Pen. You're seeing an apple or some fruit. Well, what is really going on that Hume's pointing out is that there is no apple there. In fact, you're just being bombarded with sense data. And that sense data is not connected. So notice is that we assume that all the sense data, the molecules and whatnot that we assume exist outside of us in nature, is connected to form in a unique way this fruit called the apple. But Hume is able to show, given your commitment to empiricism, that there is no connectedness. You simply have a manifold, an unconnected sense data that bombards your sense organs. And if we take Hume seriously and we suppose that we're merely bombarded with unconnected sense impressions, we're going to have to conclude we have no justification for our supposed knowledge. I know there's an apple there. You don't know that. Or that this apple is an apple because I'm associating it with previous experiences. Or that the person you're looking at, when you turn away your head and return back, has the same identity over time, and that's the same person. Restricted to radical empiricism, you can't say that. And Hume wonderfully demonstrates this. In fact, Hume's argument, taken to its logical conclusion, you're going to have to admit we don't even have knowledge that it's true or restricted only to our sensations, or the diversity of sense impressions remains unconnected. You're left in radical skepticism. You're not only just, doubting things like this, you have to further reflect back on what even Hume's saying and say, I can't even know that. Quine's position really isn't that far off from David Hume's. And as we saw earlier, it was the philosopher Vogelin that stated, this is because Quine really just an unapologetic Humean, isn't he? And since Quine's naturalized epistemology asserts that all our beliefs about the world are simply posits that go beyond the meager sense data, this leaves Quine in no position to say that we know anything about the physical world at all. Therefore, there's no way to tell whether the experimental subject in which we're studying, whether that experimental subject's beliefs are correct or false. Nor is it possible, given the Quinean proposal, to tell how the subject came to have that supposed true belief or beliefs. Why? Because it's taken for granted that Quine's epistemological project does not propose to offer a scientific study into the knowledge of the human subject. However, as you remember, it's not clear how it's possible for Quine to explain the subject's knowledge in the right way. So in other words, let me restate. If it's granted that Quine's epistemological project does propose to offer a scientific study into the knowledge of the human subject, what I'm arguing is it's not clear how he's going to be able to explain the subject's knowledge in the correct way. And moreover, if one's incapable of telling whether the subject's beliefs amount to knowledge in any way, doesn't it follow that this is clearly not a good starting point for scientific research into the knowledge of the human subject? And we've seen Stroud discuss the significance of skepticism, which are the arguments that we just raised, the skeptical arguments with regard to Quine's epistemological project. And Stroud discussing that it was not, the skeptical arguments were not to provide arguments for skepticism itself, but to show simply how Quine's own proposal is inconsistent and, in fact, incompatible and incapable of being carried out under the banner of epistemology. And that was demonstrated, I hope, in several ways. First, that I was able to show that there's difficulties with Quine's underdetermination of data thesis. What difficulties? Well, the difficulty being this: given a plurality of competing theories, all of which fit the available evidence and data, it's not possible to know or to show how any of those theories that you want to arbitrarily choose from, how they could explain how we know there's external objects in the world, and nor does it provide evidence for why we should think that the physical theory, rather than idealism or something like that, is the correct theory regarding the external world. Secondly, I hope that I was able to show that we've got some issues with Quine's belief that skeptical doubts are simply scientific doubts. The epistemologist is clearly free to use any and available things that science has to offer to answer them. In fact, I showed that even granting the skeptic the use of reductio, that knowledge about the physical world is nevertheless impossible on Quine's hypothesis. So give him his reductio, and it still does not get Quine what he wants. Furthermore, I pointed out that we can't simply proceed after using a reductio to explain how knowledge is nevertheless possible by appealing to those very beliefs about the physical world that the reductio had shown to be in the realm of what's not known. Therefore, even if skeptical doubts do originate in science, Quine, this isn't going to guarantee that one could conduct an empirical study of human knowledge correctly. Third, what I argued and what I addressed was Quine's assertion that all beliefs are merely posits or projections that go beyond the mere or the meager sense data. And as we saw from my discussion, that this implies that we don't know how the world around us actually is. And I argued that the type of project Quine envisions can only be carried out if one is able to explain subject's knowledge in the correct way. Makes sense, right? And this can only be possible if one knows that the world around him is the way he or she says it is, and that it's being that way is, well, partially responsible for him saying or believing it to be that way. However, as we've seen and as I discussed, this is not possible on Quine's naturalized epistemology. So what are we left with? Well, it just simply makes Quine's project look completely unsuccessful. And since what interested Quine was to see how knowledge was possible through observing sensory impacts on the human subject and then relating that to the output, the torrential output. Another difficulty here is the very idea that we're even impacted with sensory stimulations on what he calls our sensory surfaces. And that's because, you guessed it, that remains unknown as well. In fact, Stroud goes as far as to argue that even the belief that one even has sensory surfaces are themselves beliefs concerning the external world. Therefore, even if the existence of our sensory surfaces, that which Quine takes so easily for granted, well, that belongs to the realm of what's not known. So in conclusion, we're finding Quine posed with many difficulties with regard to his naturalized epistemology and his naturalized epistemological project. He's thrown out the idea of justificatory epistemology, and once he's done that, he's thrown out the concept of normativity. And we find him, therefore, in no position to claim that his project is concerned with human knowledge at all. Moreover, it's not even clear how Quine's idea of epistemology could be contained within natural sciences as a chapter of psychology, since, as he states, all beliefs are projections entailing that we can know nothing about the external world. Inputs and torrential outputs, or whether there are, in fact, even sensory surfaces. Furthermore, it was Stroud that pointed out, quote, if I am to see that discovery too is nothing more than a projection from my data, what attitudes do I now take to the very problem of naturalized epistemology that it's supposed to answer, end quote. So with everything that's been considered, it appears that the naturalized epistemological project, as Quine has considered and envisions it, can't answer anything. At the very least, it's a project that cannot account for normativity. And if it can't account for normativity, it doesn't deserve the right to be called epistemology. Of course, there's other critiques that could be made. And in fact, as I continue to go on with lectures on epistemology, I'd like to touch some more on transcendental arguments. because we can still take a meta step and look back and say, well, we're looking for, again, a type of foundation, even though we're not committed to classical foundationalism. And that's what I talked a little bit about yesterday. It's not as if coherentism and coherence theories are not operating foundationally, but they're rejecting the classical foundationalist project. And so we'll have a lot more to say there, but let's just see. Got any questions here? Does it look like I'm going blind? Do I get glasses? Looks like we've got some debates on, but I want to see if you guys have any. What is a good introduction to epistemology? There is an anthology on, let's see, I can't remember the name of this offhand. Well, I've got this one here that's, it's not bad. It's, this is, kid you not, guy's name's Bonjour. Weird, it looks like everything went red. Somebody turn the heat lamp off. I'm dying. There, thank you for turning. Oh, I see what it is. I think it's the blue is causing it to go change colors. Why can't I remember the name of? Let me just look up real quick. Because recall isn't. Let's see, epistemology. It's the famous one. It's really good. It's really. Sorry, guys. I'm actually gonna get. So I don't have to use these. I apologize for the audio. Sometimes my clothes or my beard scratches. Probably sounds like ruffling paper. I am getting some nice microphones and we'll avoid that problem. So hopefully the audio wasn't too bad and I didn't know anybody too bad on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ernest Sosa. So let me just pop this link here. This is the one. This is a really in-depth. Again, epistemology is really difficult. I mean, at some level, this is just a cursory view and purview of epistemology. And you can see actually how difficult it is. It gets much more difficult, but that's okay. You can see that. That's Ernest Sosa, who's a famous epistemologist, and has compiled an anthology of different thinkers on the issues of epistemology. Again, sometimes what's nice is being a philosophy professor, you get free books. This was one of them. I think that's a nice overview. He seems to be committed, Bonjour, that is, to a classical foundationalist model rather than a coherence. But he's fairly unbiased in his treatment of all the various views. So that's not a bad one as well. I'm trying to think if I have. I'm going to dig through my bookshelf now. Did you know that I have an underground and the books keep going down and down and down. They do not stop. Oh, wouldn't that be cool? Okay, what else do we have? John Chrysostom. Hello, brother. Good to see you here. St. Augustine. Marco. Woo lad. Thank you for all of you coming. Also, I'm open to other lectures too that you guys would like to discuss. Let's see. Oh, scratch. I'm thinking, and some of you have brought this up before, we're interested in philosophy of mind. And I find those very, very interesting topics. Philosophy of mind covers a wide range of different topics. And so I could either kind of just do a general overview of kind of the most popular views contemporary philosophy, or I could focus on something specific. But within philosophy of mind, again, you're going to have the ideas of identity theory, reductionism, all the various materialist theories, the substance dualist theories, how materialism differs from physicalism. You're going to have emergentism. You're going to have issues of what's called the hard problem and the easy problem. How could a machine like this, like a brain, ever be able to learn and stuff? That's the easy problem. The hard problem is consciousness. Consciousness meaning awareness, that I'm having a what it's like, or a qualitative, that's what I call qualia, a qualitative experience of what it's like to taste that water. But obviously I poured that on the table. The table's, or if I put it on a plant even, the plant might react, but it's not having a what it's like experience because it lacks consciousness. Consciousness, therefore, is attributed to animals and humans because there's a what it's like to experience the world. That's very interesting topic. And in fact, you have a lot of the refutations of materialism and what's called the irreducibility of consciousness arguments. And those are fantastic. I find those very enjoyable and fun to work through. As fun as philosophy can be. Also, many of you might be interested in artificial intelligence, whether it's possible to get silicone chips or a machine to become conscious or to know things. That's a great topic as well. And that leads into issues of transhumanism, how human beings are to view transhumanism. So I think that might be an interesting topic, but I'm open to other, let's see if you guys have. Yes, I do know Daniel Dennett. I mean, not personally. I think I've been to a lecture. He does not, yeah, Daniel Dennett's called an eliminative materialist. So you have different camps within materialism, even reductive materialism, which would attempt to take consciousness and higher level mental phenomena and reduce it simply to the lower level subvening base, which would be your neuronal brain activities. And there's different types of reductions that can be done, ontological or epistemological reductions. But Daniel Dennett takes a different move and just says, let's just eliminate consciousness. So, and the reason why he wants to do that is because consciousness as a first-person subjective phenomenon is a problem for the materialist who's committed to a third-person objective point of view and vocabulary that can't account for. So one thing that Daniel Dennett's going to do is, well, let's just eliminate consciousness. It's not real. It's a trick of the machine does. So that's why he's called an eliminative materialist. We could talk about that. Prior to Daniel Dennett, you have what we call identity theorists that rather than trying to carve off higher level mental phenomena like consciousness and reductive materialists are going to say, well, it's real. We can just reduce it as an identity. So mental states are simply brain states. And then you have type identity theorists. So we can go over all that if you're interested. Let's see what other... I gotta squint my eyes because the writing on the live chat is small. My eyes are weak. Who's that? Who's there? I can't see you. Traditional Christian would like to know about orthodox hylomorphism in philosophy of mind. It's a good question. Somebody had brought this up earlier too. I'm not saying that the orthodox position is a hylomorphic position, but of all the available positions, it's most easily accommodated to the orthodox position on the anthropology of man. I don't think that there's anything implicitly contradictory about the hylomorphic view with the orthodox dogmas and understanding of the human person. I do believe certainly materialism, and this might be a shock to somebody, but substance dualism is completely incompatible with orthodox doctrine. In fact, it's a good example of how people run into heresies. They're committed. This is William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig becomes a heretic even by Protestant standards because his commitment to substance dualism, and he runs into the heresy, which I think he even admits, of Apollinarianism. Perry Robinson has a great article on this. Is William Lane Craig a Christian? That I recommend. But so my point is clearly materialism and the antithesis and antinomy of materialism, substance dualism, is incompatible with orthodoxy. So what do we have? Well, philosophically, within the history of philosophy, we have the kind of mean between those two extremes with his hylomorphic theory. I'm not saying it's completely adequate to answer various issues. It's certainly, I believe, enough to refute materialism and substance dualism and give a better account of how, and again, one of the issues with philosophy of mind is how do mental thoughts connect to my body and cause. So if I'm having the thought that I'm thirsty right now and I would like a drink of water, reach down and grab the glass and drink. How does the mental thought reach down, grab the glass and take a sip, causally interact with the body when you define the list of attributes of mental phenomenon as being non-extended in space, non-extended in space, first person subjective, right? So what does that mean? That means that if I'm having the experience of, oh, it tastes so good, it tastes like whatever quality, you have no access to that. You can't do brain surgery. Just like if I'm thinking of a particular triangle, you're not going to do brain surgery and then find it. Oh, there it is. I can see the why. Because mental life, consciousness, and the what it's like experiences are within the category of first person, like the subject, first person point of view. Whereas physical things like bodies are not first person. They're publicly accessible. That's why we use the vocabulary, third person objective phenomenon. It is extended through space and time. That's actually Descartes' definition of matter, res extensa in Latin, which means the extended thing. which Descartes opposes to the res cogitans, the thinking things. So that's his substance dualism. You have thinking things that aren't extended in space, and then you have physical material things, which are extended through space. And as you go on down the list of attributes that you would try to describe, what is mental phenomena, what qualities does it have, what's intentional? What intentionality means is that when I'm thinking about Paris being beautiful in springtime, my proposition and my thought that I have in my mind is not just it's not pointing out something in my brain. In fact, it's directed, it's about some state of affairs or some object outside of my mind. That in philosophy of mind and philosophy is defined as intentionality. So it doesn't mean I have an intention to do something. It's beliefs, mental states, and propositions being directed towards or being about some phenomenon, state of affairs, or entity. But notice, nobody's going to say this glass is directed and about. It's not making any claims. So it lacks intentionality. And as you go down through the list of how do we describe material bodies and how do we describe the mind, what we have is opposite attributes. And according to the principle of similitude, like must know like. So in other words, if I started moving this glass with just my mind, right, you'd certainly say he's not doing science, right? In fact, he might be doing the occult. Why? Because that's occultic properties that everybody knows. In order for an object to be moved by something else, there must be some type of community in which there's a likeness. So another physical object can move another physical object. So why do I bring that up? Because one of the issues with the mind-body problem is if mental phenomena has no communion and likeness with the attributes that we attribute and the qualities we attribute to physical bodies, how are the two causally interacting? There has to be some point. Again, it would be like when you see in movies ghosts and they try to, whoa, I'm trying to grab the glass and it's just going through I can't. Why? Because in Hollywood, ghosts are presented as immaterial substances that cannot react with the material world. So that's kind of an illustration. And you could apply that to the mind-body problem and say, well, the mind's it's immaterial. It's nothing like physical bodies. So how are the two going to causally interact? So that's one issue of the mind-body problem, and that substance dualism and materialism cannot answer. Okay, what else we got? Why aren't, WULAT? Why aren't creative energies accidents? This language of accidents, it's an Aristotelian, goes back to Aristotle, substance and accidents. And accidents are defined as those which adhere in a substance. So if I have a substance right here, there goes the red. Oh, I'm burning. Turn out the lamp. The accidents of this substance book are the secondary qualities. The blue, let's see, I don't know, what is that? 8 inches by let's say 10 by 6 or something like that. The weight, these various things. And so accidents cannot exist in the Aristotelian framework outside of substances. They're properties. So why does he call it accidents? It's not because they're causing accidents. It's to contrast that something is either what it is essentially. So for example, a triangle, the essence of a triangle is a three-sided geometric figure whose sum of angles equals 180 degrees. That's the essence or nature of a triangle. If I draw the triangle blue, that it's a right angle triangle that's a 3 inches by 4 inches by 5 inches on the hypotenuse. These are all accidental or incidental, non-essential properties of what it means to be the substance and nature and essence of a triangle. In other words, accidents can be taken away and you still essentially have the same substance. So I could change the color of this book or the triangle or the size or make it from a right angle triangle to an isosceles, and I don't change the substance. So accidental properties, or accidents as secondary properties, do not have a reality or existence outside of themselves. And this is, again, I'm not saying you have to commit to Aristotle's metaphysics and philosophy, but that's obviously why we're not going to call the divine energies accidents, because God's actions, his eternal activities that are not created, his divine energies, energeia in the Greek, the activities of God, because God is beyond being, is the very grounds of being, creates being in reality and transcends it, he's more real than real. And therefore, even his eternal activities, his divine energies, are something like, almost like substances, that they're real, given God's nature, and therefore they're not contingent upon any other substances the way accidents are. Therefore, we would not consider God's divine activities and energies to be accidents. I guess in a loose way, you could say they're kind of like the properties of God, and by which if we're capturing or pointing out that God's justice, his love, his mercy, those predications are attaching not to God's ousia, or his nature, his essence, but to his divine energies, which are, his energies really are God. So they're not emanations, they're not properties of God. For example, there's properties of me, that I'm 6 feet tall, there's various things like that. And I'm not, obviously, 6-footedness is not me, it's something that I have. And so in that way, I wouldn't call God's divine energies to be properties that he has, that's not identified with who he is. Every divine energy really is who God is. The distinction is made, it's not his essence. I don't know if that helps, but perhaps Jay and I could do a talk on some more about the divine energies. I know it's a difficult concept to grasp, and many have requested that. Sorry, I'm just reading some of these. And the redness of Father Deacon's face. Yeah. Many people have requested that further explanation of the Orthodox doctrine of divine energies and the distinction between essence and energy. So that might be a good topic. You can grow to 7 feet if you drink lots of soy milk and bean juice. That is a good way to die, or for me to become a woman. with lots of estrogen, or you just take estrogen. Soy is uncanonical. Lads and lassies. Okay, let's see what other questions we have here. Do you guys like to talk? What thoughts? Oh, interesting. What made you convert from Lutheranism to Orthodoxy? So I started with evangelical, being brought up as an evangelical Protestant, a non-denom, the non-denomination denomination. You ever heard of that one? Talk about logical contradiction. I knew there were problems with that. And particularly what started my journey is in non-denominational evangelical Christianity, the worship services. They really rubbed me the wrong way, that there was intuitively that there was something wrong with. And when I questioned this and asked about this, praise bands and worship music and fog machines and laser light shows in church, that I was told, you bigot, who are you to judge how somebody worships God? That if one person chooses to worship this way, then who are you to judge? Maybe some of you have heard the same arguments. So, this was back 17 years old. I remember asking the question. Now, some people might actually say yes to this, but I framed it in a way because I knew they'd say no. I said, well, can we get up there and play death metal, chapel and worship? Absolutely not. That is inappropriate. Bingo. Immediately, I realized, so we have a standard. We have a standard for what's not a relativist, are you? You can't just do anything in any type of worship. That there is a standard that you admit to. Now, maybe we disagree with what the standard is, but for me, that gave me, as a young lad, hope that if there is a standard, then I can discover. And that's really kind of what started me on my quest and investigation. And it came down, what makes something a church? Can you just be in the water at the beach and go look at the glories of God, that this is my church? I don't need to go to a building with a bunch of people. Well, remember what Tertullian said, one Christian is no Christian. You cannot be a Christian. I got my Bible and my Jesus, and that's all I need. And I don't need any family members or a community. That's what Tertullian is saying and condemning. One Christian is no Christian. And this is something very popular in evangelical, non-denominational Christianity. And furthermore, there is no coherent answer of what the church was. So I went further to look into church history and study the church fathers. It became immediately evident to me that the central focus of what defines a church is not simply glorifying God or worshiping or talking about God or having Bible studies or something like that, but that it's centered around the Eucharist and a Eucharistic community. And guess what? Guess what surrounds the Eucharist and the Eucharistic community? Liturgy. And I had studied Roman Catholicism at Thomas Aquinas College and the Church Fathers enough to know that I didn't want to become Roman Catholic. I'd studied Orthodoxy, but I'd have to say that I had this real deep desire and draw to East. Something was keeping me from it, and what was keeping me from Orthodoxy was myself and my own pride. If anybody's going to become Orthodox, you must acquire humility. I'm not saying that it's not important to read books and to learn the history of the church. That is possibly, you could argue, for some is a necessary condition. I need to know the history. For me, it was a necessary condition, but it was not a sufficient condition. It was not enough. And what was the sufficient condition was being able to acquire some level of humility and lowering my ego so that I could see the truths that the church was delivering once for all the saints. So my best option then was to return to my family. You know, obviously being a Norwegian American born in Minnesota, you can guess what sect that is. Most Minnesotans and Norwegians are Lutherans. And so what appealed to me about Lutheranism is it was more liturgical. Obviously, it didn't seem like people were just making up stuff, and that I liked the Lutheran hymns. A mighty fortress is. By the way, that might be the one good thing that Luther did contribute to the world, was that song. Changed my mind. The one thing Luther did that was good was write a mighty fortress as a God. Changed my mind. But the Lutheran mind. I remember watching over time when I came back from Ireland that one time and went to, I was part of not the ELCA, but the Missouri Synod. When I came back to, attend the Lutheran Church, the Missouri Synod, where I was at, all the songs were different. They weren't these old, the old hymns that like praise songs. They were some of this evangelical praise music had come in, and that's exactly what I did not want to see. And so I spoke to the pastor. I'm like, "What's going on?" We're like, "Who told you could just change this stuff?" Oh, well, the answer was, "You're just, you know what? You're one of those more traditional types. But there's other people that like the contemporary music and stuff like that, and so to each his own." I think it was at that point when I heard that answer, I'm like, the truth does not lie with the Lutherans. Heck, next thing you know, you're going to start changing the Eucharist from bread and wine to ketchups and French fries, because that looks, for some people, that reminds them more of body and blood than wine and bread. Again, hence my question, who told you can change this stuff? And again, that led me to further questions and to explore orthodoxy further and studying the church fathers and the history of the church, the canons, the canonicity of scripture, and that coupled with the miracle that I experienced in a liturgy solidified it for me. So I hope that answers. Maybe someday I can go further into that, but that answers your question. Got a good crew here. I'm trying to see. We did 2 hours. You guys tired? Excuse me. St. Augustine, Father Deacon, are we to conceive energy as emanation? Nope. We are not. They're not emanating from an impersonal force, a monad, like Plotinus or something like that. But in fact, they are the real uncreated activities of God that are really Him, not emanations, but really God, just God outside of His. So God acts outward. This is why we see this with Christ on the Greek word kenosis, kenotic, to empty oneself out, rather than to draw oneself in and self-focus. Who God is and what He does is to pour Himself out. It's pouring His movement outwards, i.e., the uncreated energies are not emanations from a static, but they're personal. Just like, again, it's not like radiating heat off. Hold on, let's turn the heat on again. It's not like I'm radiating heat and it's emanating off of me through the computer, through your computer into your home. But rather it's something akin to me coming to you personally and giving and acting, showing love, that this is the way that you would get to know me. The only difference is my going outward to you and my activities by which you get to know who I am. My activities are not me. It's what I do. The difference with God is his outward motion from his ousian essence is God. The activities that God does is God. It's just not, the distinction is not his essence, because he remains in a dark cloud, incapable of being accessed intellectually or ontologically. Otherwise, as Jay and I said yesterday, you'd end up creating further hypostases within the Godhead, which is absurd. Or you would break the simplicity of God's essence. So, great question. Do you see the uncreated light as we're talking? God is sending his glory upon us in our conversation. Not because I'm holy, I'm a sinner in need of God's grace. I'm causing the lights to go all wonky like that. Yeah, great one, St. Augustine. Would we say God is not composed of substance and accident because he's beyond being and its source? Absolutely. It's exactly with everything that Aquinas says. Aquinas does have something on this, is in the Summa Theologica, part 1, question, I think it's question 2. I just got to find the article. Whether God is a genus. Article 5, whether God is contained in a genus. And then it proceeds into Article 6, whether in God there are any accidents. It's actually an interesting. Now, again, his is going to be a little bit different than the conclusion that we Orthodox would make, because Aquinas associates, God's essentia with God's esse. So in Latin, essentia is essence, and being is esse. So, for example, what Aquinas says is that with all contingent created things, and by thing you could say book, there's nothing contained in the concept or form book or triangle, whatever you want to put, human being, that entails existence. In other words, essence and existence are separate for contingent created beings. Therefore, what it requires is that existence must be added to essences to make them real and to exist. Because why? They don't have it of themselves. They're not necessary beings. They're contingent beings. And therefore, Aquinas concludes that essence and existence are separate. However, from his 5 ways, he concludes that if God is the first mover, he's the first efficient cause, the second way. 3, if the third way, if he is necessary being, then therefore God is, since he's first cause, he has no potency. Why? Well, then he wouldn't be first cause, right? Something would, in actuality, would cause the potency to become actuality. The example on the first way would be something like cold water is potentially hot, but not actually hot. Well, how do you get what's potentially hot to become actually hot? You don't start adding more potentially hot things and dry ice and ice cubes and stuff like that in order to make the cold water that's potentially hot actually hot. What you do is you take something actually hot, a fire. So what we have is these concepts of actuality and potency. Act brings what's in potency to become act or hot. And the series can be taken back. Either there's a first to that or there isn't. And if the first is potency, then again, just like this, an infinite amount of potency or an infinite amount of no's doesn't equal a yes. It's not magically. And therefore, there must be a first Aquinas reasons that has no potency, that's pure actuality. Now, actuality in Aristotelian terms refers to being, and potency refers to becoming. And therefore, Aquinas concludes that God is actus purus. And if he's actus purus, pure actuality, has no potency, then God's essence is being, it is existence. And that's why the Roman Catholics can interpret what is your name? I am who am, is that God is superabundant essence, that God's essence is existence. Aquinas will then take that, and then from Article 5 to 7 that I just cited, will then use that to say, within being itself, not a being, but being itself, it's beyond all genus and beyond, there are no accidents within. And again, this gets into divine simplicity too, because accidents imply division. And therefore, there are no accidents in God, and he cannot be associated with a substance or part of a genus. He's writing his, one sense in his conclusion. However, the orthodox position is that God's essence is not being. God is beyond being. So hopefully that answers. Sorry for rattling on. Yeah, good one. Summa Theologica Part 1. Question, I don't remember. So it goes like this, the division. Part 1, Part 2, parts, questions, and then articles within the question. This is Article 4. The first part of the Summa Theologica deals with that God's existence is different from his essence, correct? Good one, guys. I think it was really nice. Appreciate your questions. I still haven't. I got to check. I still haven't had super chat set up. I think it requires a certain level of subscribers. So if you have not liked and subscribed, please do, so I can get up and start super chats on the computer screen. Well, have a blessed day, everyone. And again, nice. You need at least 2,000 subs. Dang. That's a lot. Thank you, Marco, sorry. And a certain amount of hours watched too, yeah. And I just found out too, I was trying to stream something when I was having problems. I was trying to stream from the iPhone here, and it says that you have to have, what was it? Something like that, 1,000 subscribers or 2,000 subscribers before you can stream from your iPhone. What are all these obstacles that they're putting? Why do they do that? It's a good question. They'll make you jump through these hoops. YouTube, you're not my mom and dad. You can't tell me what to do. Use Streamlabs, yeah. There's something in my throat, sorry. Water. I have Streamlabs. I've been working with that. I'm having some issues that I'm working out, some bugs. Part of the reason is I haven't received my camera yet, and so I'm just working off my Surface tablet, which does not have a lot of CPU, and is making some problems connecting to YouTube and doing live. But I like the Streamlabs because I can put up the pictures, different text, and more interactive. So hopefully I will have that going pretty good pretty soon. Okay, any other questions before I head off? Thank you, all of you. We'll continue some more podcasts on epistemology. Let's see if I can find my philosophy of mind. And I'm going to get this a bit more organized too. What happens is I end up reading books, and then I put them back, not nice and neat, not ordered. But I have gone to confession for that. I will correct my evil ways of not ordering books properly. It was supposed to be certain themes. Let's see, philosophy, orthodox theology, Western theology, philosophy, science. That's all mixed up too. So it makes it difficult for me to find. Makes me difficult to find my books, and I've got another bookshelf too. But I think the philosophy of mind would be a good lecture to do. I think you guys would really enjoy that. Yeah, that's right. Here's a dialectic of opposite books on the shelf for icons. You cannot have them both. You know why that's happened, right? That is because I've run out of room to put my icons, and I have to put them on my bookshelf. And the icons are blessing all the heretics back there, right? Keeping them at bay. Heresy from spreading. If there's any heresy, is gonna be on my bookshelf, and it ain't gonna leave, right? It ain't gonna go anywhere, because why? I got my icons. I'm kidding, but yeah, that's got a lot of icons, and it goes further further up and further down. St. James, St. Paisios, First Martyr Archdeacon Stephen, St. John of the Ladder, St. Spiridon, Theotokos, St. John Maximovich. Oh, St. Ananias. But you haven't seen an icon of St. Ananias the Apostle. Well, blessings, brothers and sisters. God bless you. Pray for me and look forward to our next stream. And a blessed day and evening to all of you.